Good afternoon, and welcome to Brandeis. Truth, even unto its innermost parts, is not just a Brandeis motto. It is a core value of the university and has been since its inception. It is a challenge that often is not easily met. Issues of war and peace, ethics, and social justice frequently touch nerves made raw by personal suffering or by empathy for those who are suffering. Nowhere is this more the case than in a long, painful, continuing strife between Israelis and Palestinians. Whether by listening to the experience of victims of violence on both sides, standing up for the presence on the Brandeis campus for a Brandeis faculty who is an outstanding Palestinian professor, building a partnership with a Palestinian university, hosting appearances by senior Israeli leaders or a controversial former president, Brandeis has always been up to the challenge, even when some, both within and outside its walls, have not. The Gaza conflict, early this year, and its aftermath, posed the latest test to intelligent inquiry, thoughtful analysis, and civilized discourse. Emotions run high, and feelings of injustice are rampant. In the aftermath of this conflict, Justice Richard Goldstone, our first speaker today, examined both Israeli and Palestinian actions. His commission's report has been embraced by some and rejected by others, including by our second speaker, former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Dore Gold. The directors of the two sponsoring centers, Dan Terris and Ilan Troin, will more formally introduce these two gentlemen. This report charges both Palestinian and Israeli authorities with war crimes, but its deeper implications explore the complex legal and moral issues surrounding the conduct of warfare in an era when the rules of engagement are rapidly changing. While the arguments over the Gaza report have been heated, there's actually substantial agreement on the underlying principles involved. 2 weeks ago, Dan Meridor, Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, spoke here at Brandeis and delivered a stirring account of Israeli commitment to the principles of preserving civilian lives in the context of conflict. Yet, the specifics of the conflict in Gaza led to dramatically different conclusions about the legal and moral basis of Israeli actions. The mission led by Justice Goldstone concluded, on the basis of its investigations, that Israel engaged in a deliberate policy of collective punishment of the people of Gaza, and as such committed deeds that should be classified as war crimes. Israeli leaders have reacted with outrage, arguing that they were responding to months of shelling of Israeli civilians and that their forces made every effort to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, arguing that the Hamas military wing cynically embedded its military operations within civilian neighborhoods. Which brings me to this event. First of all, I want you to note that we were able to have the General Assembly of the United Nations hold a debate on the Goldstone report just yesterday to serve as background for our event. Our timing is absolutely perfect. But unlike the UN, we will not have a long procession of speakers in numerous languages. We will also hold no vote and make no resolutions. While we're very glad for the presence of the press, both local and from abroad, and I'm pleased to note that we are now streaming this event across campus and through the web to an audience of many viewers across the world. This event, however, is first and foremost intended for this campus community and to you as individuals in this hall. We hope that what is discussed here today will help you make up your own mind on important and highly contested issues that too often are argued with more heat than light. While we assume there will be many points of dispute, we hope and expect that what will take place here will become the basis for further reflections and probing. We are examining yet again another difficult issue in the long festering Arab-Israeli conflict. It is not a distant historical event, to be debated by historians and scholars. We are probing an event which nearly everyone here has witnessed on the television screen and has read about in news releases, blogs, and numberless communications that are flashing across the web. I would suggest that the issues that arise from the specifics of the violence in Gaza and Israel's Negev are of more than parochial interest. America, like other modern nations, is bedeviled by fighting distant wars against non-state militants who are often hard to distinguish as they mix and melt into civilian populations. We have entered a new age of warfare. How one deals in such situations effectively and morally, with minimal injury to an opponent's innocence while protecting one's own, is one of the salient and complex issues of our times. Brandeis students, engrossed in the study of philosophy, ethics, Middle East studies, Israel studies, international relations, and a host of fields that engage our minds and concerns across this campus, will find much to engage them in this evening's deliberations. I welcome members of our community and all communities outside of Brandeis to this campus, but I'm sure you will understand that priority in the questioning that will follow the presentations will be given to Brandeis University students and faculty. Please join me now in listening to these gentlemen with the respect and civility that are essential to pursuing truth even unto its innermost parts. Giving people the chance to speak freely and carefully considering and responding to what they have to say is what we here at Brandeis try to do every day. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Daniel Terrace. I'm director of the International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life. I'd first like to extend my thanks to Justice Richard Goldstone and Ambassador Dore Gold for honoring us with their presence tonight. Both of you have made great efforts to be here to honor the shared commitments to peace and justice that President Reinhardt's just described. I'd also like to thank President Reinhardt for his longstanding commitment to tackling controversial issues here at Brandeis. And I'd like to thank Professor Ilan Troen and Stephanie Gerber-Wilson of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies for sharing the pleasures and challenges of hosting this event with me. Before I introduce Justice Goldstone, just a few words about the format of our event today. First of all, this is not a debate. No doubt, Justice Goldstone and Ambassador Gold will disagree sharply on some key issues, but they are not here to score points. This event is an exploration of both a specific situation and of important principles. The Middle East and the laws of war are complex and multifaceted topics, and the goal of this evening is illumination, not confrontation. Following my introduction, Justice Goldstone will speak. Professor Troen will introduce Ambassador Gold, who will speak as a respondent. I will then moderate a question and answer period, during which we will ask for succinct questions for both speakers from the audience, with priority, as President Reinhardt's indicated, for Brandeis University students and faculty. Professor Troen will then ask our speakers for closing comments and offer some final remarks. This event is neither the first word nor the last on this subject here at Brandeis. It is part of a continuing conversation on this campus that involves a broad spectrum of voices and opinions. Informed discussion starts with careful listening, and I reiterate President Reinhardt's request that we show our speakers today the courtesy and civility for which this community is known. And I also ask that you honor our request that no cameras or cell phones be used during the event. The most important development in international law in the last 2 decades has been the creation of legal standards and institutions designed to safeguard the rights and the welfare of the world's most vulnerable people. I put it this way because international humanitarian and criminal law as Richard Goldstone has practiced and advocated for it, is not about abstract principles or about punishing wrongdoers. The law for Justice Goldstone is about preserving human lives and human dignity. He has pursued this commitment with sufficient vigor and competence over the last 2 decades to become the world's leading figure in international justice, for which he was honored by the MacArthur Foundation in June of this year. A native of South Africa, a commercial lawyer by background, Justice Goldstone first came to prominence as the head of a commission that courageously investigated state-sponsored violence under the apartheid regime in his own country. In 1994, he was named as one of the first justices of the Constitutional Court in the newly democratic South Africa. Then came a surprise, an invitation to serve as the first prosecutor for the new United Nations tribunals based in The Hague that would investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity during the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. In that position, Justice Goldstone helped establish the legal precedents and institutions that represented the first substantial accountability for crimes against humanity since the Nuremberg trials a half-century before. Through his service as a judge and a prosecutor, Justice Goldstone developed a reputation for independence and integrity that made him a natural choice for controversial assignments in the international community. He led an independent inquiry that looked into the legal and moral basis of NATO's bombing campaign in the 1999 Kosovo conflict. While the mission on the Gaza conflict, our reason for being here today, was done at the request of the United Nations, his most recent assignment before the Gaza conflict was an investigation of the United Nations itself. He worked with Paul Volcker as part of a 3-person commission that investigated corruption in the UN in relation to the oil for food scandal, a sensitive inquiry that went all the way to the office of the Secretary General. In April of this year, he agreed to head a United Nations mission to investigate the Gaza conflict, working as the head of a 4-person team that included a Pakistani human rights expert, an Irish military expert, and a British expert on international law. Their report was presented to the Human Rights Council in September, and its findings with regard to Israel and Hamas have since been endorsed by the Council and forwarded to the General Assembly, where, as President Reinhardt's noted, they took it up this week to coincide with our event. It remains to be seen what formal actions will be taken in response to its recommendations by Israel, by Hamas, and by the international community. Justice Goldstone is a familiar figure here at Brandeis, where he was awarded an honorary degree in 2004. He has spoken here often on a variety of topics in his role as board member and now chair of the board of the International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life, and in his role as founding leader of our Brandeis Institute for International Judges. Needless to say, members of the Brandeis community do not always agree with his stances and opinions, but his character and commitment to principle have always commanded this community's respect. Please join me in welcoming Justice Richard Goldstone.
Well, President Reinhardt, Dr. Terrace, thank you very much indeed for your warm introduction, Dan. It's always a great pleasure to come to Brandeis, and I do that, I'm happy to say, on many occasions. And I'm very grateful to Brandeis University for making this occasion possible, and in particular, I'm grateful to Ambassador Dore Gold for agreeing to participate in this discussion. One thing I'm sure about that Ambassador Gold and I will agree on, and that is our desire for peace and justice for all of the people of the Middle East. It is to Israel's credit that it is concerned, and I think the overwhelming majority of its citizens are concerned about many of the accusations in the Gaza report. Israel is a democracy in which many of its citizens are committed to human rights and the rule of law. Sadly, as appears from our report, the same cannot be said of Gaza. They are neither able nor at the moment willing, to react in a similar way. Even then, the reports coming out of Gaza indicate a suggestion of domestic investigations with international assistance, and that, of course, would be an unusual way forward in the region. I'm looking forward to this discussion with Ambassador Gold, and I hope and anticipate that we'll get down to substance and avoid much of the rhetoric and personal attacks ad hominem attacks that have marked much of the discussions on the Gaza report to date. Those personal and very unpleasant attacks, I regret, have masked and obfuscated rather than made easier to understand important issues raised in the report. At the outset, I would like to address and hopefully get out of the way 4 core and fundamental issues. The first is the record of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. It is a subsidiary body of the General Assembly, and it was established in March 2006 as a successor to the Commission on Human Rights, which had been heavily criticized for having countries in its membership with poor human rights. Unfortunately, some members of the new council, the Human Rights Council, continue to be states with poor human rights records. Their participation, and indeed their leadership of the Human Rights Council, threatened the legitimacy of that body as a voice for human rights. The leadership of the United Nations has openly acknowledged that the Human Rights Council focuses a disproportionate amount of attention on Israel. The former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, criticized the Council, I quote, for disproportionate focus on violations by Israel while neglecting other parts of the world, such as Darfur, which he referred to as a far graver crisis. He later added that Israel should not be given a free pass, but that the Council should give the same attention to grave violations in other states as well. I fully agree with those views, and I have spoken out on many occasions over the last few years against the unfair and partial treatment meted out to Israel by the Human Rights Council. That having been said, it should be acknowledged that at its most recent session in Geneva, the Council adopted appropriate resolutions on the human rights situations in Burma, Somalia, Honduras, and Cambodia, and unanimously supported resolutions on freedom of expression, migrants' rights, HIV/AIDS, and access to medicines. It is disappointing that the Human Rights Council refused a request from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, to investigate war crimes allegedly committed in the war in Sri Lanka. It is a matter for regret that the international media, too, does not pay sufficient attention to these and other human rights crises. Although the Bush administration decided not to seek a seat on the Human Rights Council, that policy was reversed by the Obama administration, and the United States seat was taken up earlier this year. This is a very positive step. We need the United States to be a leader on human rights and to be the leader in reforming the Human Rights Council. The second issue I want to address is the mandate of the fact-finding mission on Gaza, which I led. On this, there is the repeated allegation that the mandate I accepted was biased against Israel. That is not true. The original mandate, contained in a January resolution of the Human Rights Council, was indeed biased against Israel. It referred and called for an investigation only of violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law committed by Israel. When I was approached, that was the mandate, and I rejected it. I rejected it for the same reason that Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland and former High Commissioner for Human Rights, rejected it. Since the report was published, Mary Robinson has publicly supported the mandate given to me and has objected to her refusal of the original mandate being used to attack the mandate under which we operated. Let me tell you the story of the new mandate, or the mandate that I accepted. I refused the biased mandate, and I thought that was the end of my participation. But fortunately or unfortunately, with hindsight, I was asked to come and meet with the then president of the Human Rights Council, the Nigerian ambassador, Martin Uhamoibi. I'd never met him. We immediately took a liking to each other. He's a very warm personality. And he said to me in his office in Geneva, "How would you word an even-handed mandate?" And I told him I would word an even-handed mandate to make it clear that the investigation was into human rights violations and humanitarian law violations committed by all sides relevant to Operation Cast Lead. He said, "Would you write it out for me?" I wrote it out, a very rough version, gave it to him, and he said, "Well, if you're prepared to do it, that's your mandate. As president, I have to appoint the mission, and I'm sure that the Human Rights Council, if I put it to them, would accept it." Well, it was very difficult to refuse a mandate that I had, in fact, written for myself. This mandate represented, let me say, the first time in the history of the Human Rights Council or its predecessor that there had been an even-handed mandate in respect of the Middle East and in particular of Israel. The mandate expressly, and I quote, is to investigate all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law that might have been committed at any time in the context of the military operations that were conducted in Gaza during the period 27 December 2008 and 18th January 2009, whether before, during, or after. It appeared to me, and it was really my sincere hope, and I would add expectation, that Israel would seize this opportunity of an even-handed mandate and cooperate with the mission. This was the first opportunity for Israel to use a United Nations fact-finding mission to look into the issues that concerned it. When the mandate was reported by President Uhamoibi to a plenary session of the Human Rights Council, there were no objections voiced at all by a single member. But what is more important, when the Human Rights Council adopted our report in September, 2 months ago, it adopted the whole report, and that included findings we made that Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups had committed serious war crimes against Israel and possibly crimes against humanity. And this was the first time. It was the first time that there was a report that made those allegations, and obviously the first time that they'd been accepted by the Human Rights Council. It included also the first description in a United Nations document of the details of the terror that has been suffered by the residents of southern Israel, such as those who live in the city of Sderot, and all others who live within the range of the rockets and mortars that have been fired in their many thousands over a number of years from Gaza into southern Israel. We, unfortunately, were not allowed to visit southern Israel. We were not allowed, our mission was not allowed by the Israeli government to come into Israel, so we couldn't go to southern Israel, where we would have liked to have met there with the victims, and to go to the West Bank to meet there too, to investigate aspects relevant to Operation Cast Lead. Before my appointment was announced, I pleaded with the Israeli ambassador to meet with me. I said that I wanted to discuss with him how we should go about implementing our mandate. What were the issues of interest to Israel? I said we were prepared to go at short notice to Jerusalem to meet with the Israeli government, with the Israeli Defense Force, to discuss and seek advice from them on the implementation of our mandate. The response I got from the ambassador, firstly, he wasn't prepared to meet with me because he said he had no authority from Jerusalem, which I found disappointing. But I then got a written response to my letter to the effect that while there was no aspersion made towards me, that the Israeli government was not prepared to cooperate with the mission appointed by the Human Rights Council. And he referred to the mandate. I responded, again pleading for the Israeli government to reconsider its view. I said the mandate to which it referred is not the mandate I've accepted, and I gave my assurance that we would look at all issues that were relevant to both sides in the Middle East. It took some weeks. There was no response to my request for a reconsideration, and I followed it up with a personal plea to Prime Minister Netanyahu, offering to come at short notice to meet with him, any members of his government, any members of the Israel Defense Force that could assist us in implementing the mission. Some 2 months went by before I received a response to both my letters requesting a reconsideration and the letter to the Prime Minister in which it was reiterated that there would be no cooperation. The views of the Israeli Minister of Welfare, Isaac Herzog, on Israel's attitude towards the mission was reported in Haaretz on October the 28th of this year, not many days, in fact last week. Haaretz said the welfare minister went on to lament Israel's failure to cooperate with the Goldstone Commission, saying that it was a mistake. Quote, there was a systematic failure in Israel's handling of the issue up until the actual report was made public, he said, and I couldn't agree more. The third issue I want to get out of the way is what the mandate included and what it did not include. The mandate of the mission's task was to investigate violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law. For those of you who are not used to the terminology, humanitarian law really refers to the laws applying to armed conflict, what used in the old days to be called the laws of war. We considered that this required us to consider the manner in which both sides had used military force, and not the justification or otherwise of having resorted to military force. I've publicly stated on many occasions that Israel has the right under international law not only to protect its citizens from rocket and mortar attacks from Gaza, but it has a clear duty to do so. Therefore, under international law, Israel was fully justified in using military force to that end. I doubt that Ambassador Gold will disagree with me on this point. Our mandate did not call on us to evaluate the right to use military force. That was taken as a given, and the issue with which we were concerned was whether the manner in which that military force was used was consistent with international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. Many of those who have attacked the report raise the issue of Israel's legitimate right to defend itself. Let me be absolutely clear on this. International law allows and indeed requires Israel to defend its citizens against terror attacks. And there's not a word in the report that could be interpreted in any other way. As I have already said, the mission found in unequivocal terms that Hamas and other armed militants committed serious war crimes against the people of southern Israel. The report contains, as I have said to the best of my knowledge, the first international analysis of the terror suffered by the people of southern Israel. And from the interviews we had, we, the United Nations, flew witnesses to Geneva to give public testimony, and we conducted nearly 50 telephone discussions, because we couldn't go there, with leaders and witnesses in southern Israel. And the report sets out the effect these rockets have had on cities like Sderot and Ashkelon. People have left the area. It's affected the economy. It's affected employment. But more importantly, it's terrorized women and children every day of their life. It's not pleasant to live in a situation where your children go to school and get less than 45 seconds notice of rockets coming at them from Gaza. And that's set out in chapter 24 of the report in some detail. And it led us to the conclusion that the militants firing these rockets have committed serious war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. After our report was released, the mayor of Sderot sent me an email asking how we could not have come to see the destruction and the terror in his town, and he invited me to do so. I was surprised that he wasn't aware that our mission had requested permission to visit Sderot and other cities in southern Israel, but that had been refused to us by his own government. I explained to him in response what I've explained to you, and I've accepted his invitation when next I'm in Israel to visit Sderot. The fourth issue is that our investigation was not a judicial or even a quasi-judicial proceeding. We expressly did not apply a criminal law standard of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In this regard, I was misunderstood by a journalist from the Forward, to whom I explained, I thought carefully, that our report would not constitute evidence in a court of law. It's a report, it's hearsay evidence, and that the findings we made for the purpose of any future proceedings would have to be investigated afresh. And I explained that that's specifically why we called for independent investigations, domestic investigations in Israel and in Gaza. In that context, I stated that if in appropriate criminal proceedings the findings we had made were not established, that would not cause me a problem, and that remains my position. Let me turn now to the substance. We referred in our report to what has become known as the Dahia Doctrine. It was explained in March 2008 by Major General Gadi Eisenkot of the Israel Defense Force. He said what happened in the Dahia quarter of Beirut in 2006 will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction. Well, disproportionate force is exactly what the law of war, humanitarian law, outlaws. War crimes are committed when disproportionate force is used. On the 6th of January 2009, during the military operations, Deputy Prime Minister Eli Yishai said, quote, "It should be possible to destroy Gaza, so they will understand not to mess with us. It is a great opportunity to demolish thousands of homes of all the terrorists, so that they will think twice before they launch rockets. I hope the operation will come to an end with great achievements and with the complete destruction of the terrorism and Hamas. In my opinion," he said, "they should be razed to the ground, so thousands of houses, tunnels, and industry will be demolished," unquote. Our investigation, in fact, showed that that doctrine was applied in Operation Cast Lead. That is the issue that we investigated. The attacks on civilians during the ground war must also be evaluated in the light of those stated objectives. It explains, I would suggest, the high civilian death toll and the huge destruction of private homes. Over 5,000 homes completely destroyed, and estimates vary between 25,000 and 40,000 homes that were partially destroyed, both from the air and from ground attack. The attacks on the infrastructure of Gaza, over 200 industrial factories put out of action, most of them destroyed. The only flour-producing factory put out of action. Most of the egg-producing facilities of Gaza were completely destroyed with the killing of many, many thousands of chickens. Water supplies bombed. Water treatment plants bombed. Sanitation plants bombed with huge spillage in nearly 2 square kilometers of agricultural land. Agricultural farms bulldozed by Israeli tank bulldozers. And this applied to many, many square miles of farms. The effect on unemployment in Gaza is now over 60%. Latest estimates from reliable sources, some 90% of the people in Gaza live on less than $1 a day. Again, Minister of Welfare Isaac Herzog reported in Haaretz. He severely criticized fellow cabinet ministers for making remarks during Israel's offensive in Gaza last winter, which Herzog, and I'm quoting from Haaretz, which Herzog argues were used by the Goldstone Commission to demonstrate that Israel had knowingly planned to commit war crimes. It's correct. Herzog aimed his criticism at Shas Chairman Eli Yishai and at Chaim Ramon, who served as Deputy Prime Minister during the offensive, saying that they had, quote, repeatedly voiced the need for harsh response to Gaza rocket fire. That strategy that was adopted by the Israel Defense Force completely undermines the norms of humanitarian law, the distinction between civilians and combatants. That is the essence of what war crimes are all about. Again, Israel has the absolute right and indeed duty to defend its citizens. I repeat, I think for the third time. But in doing so, its responses must be proportionate. That is the law, and up to now, that law has been accepted by Israel. Our methodology. We relied primarily on what we were told, what we heard with our own ears, and what we saw with our own eyes. It is a matter for deep personal regret that we were not informed of the version of the government of Israel and the Israeli Defense Force. Some groups, such as Magen David Adom, indirectly sent us information, and a team visited our staff in Geneva very late, but that was clearly no substitute for official assistance and the right to visit Israel and the West Bank. It makes the need for credible investigation all the more necessary and desirable. Let us put aside the specifics in our report for a moment and look at the larger issue. The fundamental organizing principle of international human rights is respect for human dignity. Attacks on civilians and civilian structures on both sides is the clear consequence of the dehumanization of each side by the other. You cannot treat people in that way if you regard them as worthy of respect as fellow human beings. As long as that continues, there cannot be any hope for peace in the Middle East. If you regard people as your equals, as equal human beings, you don't treat them in that way. You don't fire rockets at them, and you don't bulldoze their lands. It requires good and courageous leaders, I would suggest, to put a stop to it. As a South African, I know that peace can be achieved in just about any situation with good leadership. And I hope and pray that such leadership will emerge on both sides sooner rather than later. I can do no better at Brandeis University than to conclude with the words of Justice Louis Brandeis himself. He said, "The government is the potent, omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. It invites anarchy. To declare that the end justifies the means, to declare that the government may commit crimes, would bring terrible retribution." Thank you.
Is this set up? It's all set.
Thank you, Justice Goldstone. We appreciate your coming to Brandeis and your willingness to share the platform with Dore Gold, an Israeli long familiar with the United Nations and experienced in speaking on behalf of his country. In agreeing to a dialogue, you provided an example of respect for open discourse that we admire and encourage on the Brandeis campus. And you also treated us to a rare display of eloquence, which we also appreciate. Justice Goldstone, we are all in your debt. I also thank Dr. Dore Gold, a renowned scholar of the contemporary Middle East and a distinguished Israeli public figure, for agreeing to join Justice Goldstone on this platform. This is the first time that an Israeli of Ambassador Gold's stature will respond directly to an author of the report. We are in his debt for agreeing to do so. Israel has steadfastly refused to engage with the fact-finding mission, even as it has constantly emphasized the high personal regard in which it holds Justice Goldstone. Nevertheless, Israel argues that the official mandate, formulated by a cluster of states with long-standing hostility to Israel, and adopted by the Human Rights Council and never rescinded by it, even if Justice Goldstone objected to it, is one-sided. Canada, Japan, and Switzerland, states of the European Union, and others voted against the resolution, and still others abstained. Individuals well known for their commitment to human rights refused to accept responsibility for the mission. On submission of the report's findings, the number of states opposing the actual report has grown. 2 days ago, the House of Representatives passed by a vote of 344 to 36 a resolution characterizing the report as, quote, biased and unworthy of further consideration, end quote. While to be sure there are many who accept the findings, condemnation of the report is neither isolated nor narrowly based. On accepting the commission, Justice Goldstone did attempt to formally expand the mandate as he explained to us. Yet, the 575-page report reveals that the original emphasis on Israeli culpability remains. The bulk of the report is a resounding critique of Israeli behavior in Gaza and far beyond, both in place and in time. The facts the mission offers are integrated into an overall interpretation that weaves together Israeli actions into a familiar condemnation of Israeli military doctrine, its political and legal systems, and its domestic policies. The array of accusations lumps together the choice of weapons used in Gaza with internment practices, policies regarding illegal Bedouin settlements in the Negev, the exercise of free speech and the right to assemble both within and beyond Israel's pre-1967 borders, Israel's relationship to foreign NGOs and the press, and much, much more. The Goldstone report may be the most comprehensive and damning of the many United Nations-sponsored documents castigating the Jewish state. Nothing comparable in extent and depth is done to explore and explain Hamas's persistent attacks over the years on Israeli civilians by rockets and suicide bombers, its persistent public justification of acts of terror, nor does the report similarly interrogate Palestinian society and its political culture. The anger in Israel against this report is widespread and deep. Many in the Israeli public urged on their government the use of arms in defense of Israeli lives and property long before this battle began. Popular support remains strong despite an awareness of the opprobrium this war has brought. One of Ambassador Gold's challenges is to explain why that is the case, why so many Israelis find this report so objectionable. Given the extent and severity of the charges, it seems, Ambassador Gold, that you must address at a minimum the following: the accuracy of the facts collected and analyzed by this fact-finding mission. Are there any significant facts the report does not include? Following on your response to these questions, what alterations would you suggest to the conclusions of the report? And finally, what remedies do you offer to the tragic reality that innocent civilians on both sides of the battle lines are subject to extreme hazards and injury? Even as Justice Goldstone's time was severely circumscribed, I ask Ambassador Gold to similarly restrict his response. Both Justice Goldstone and Ambassador Gold will be able to elaborate in the question and answer period. Finally, I ask of you, the audience, to extend the same attentiveness and courtesy to Ambassador Gold that you have accorded Justice Goldstone. Ambassador Gold.
I want to thank Ilan Troen and the faculty of Brandeis University for hosting me at this event. On the symbol of Brandeis University is the word truth, and that's what we're going to try and get to tonight. Let me begin by being very direct. The UN Gaza report is the most serious indictment of the State of Israel, bearing the seal of the United Nations that the UN General Assembly, The UN Gaza report is the most
serious and vicious indictment of the State of Israel, bearing the seal of the United Nations, since the UN General Assembly adopted the infamous Zionism is Racism resolution in 1975, which it subsequently repealed. The language of the report and its assertion that Israel intentionally attacked Palestinian civilians involves and amounts to an assault on Israeli society as a whole. For the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, Tzahal, is a citizens' army, an army which is made up of the people of Israel. The report simply distorts the very essence of what Israel stands for and provides fuel for those seeking its delegitimization. Before I go further, I just want to make one point about the United Nations as a body which examines what goes on in the Middle East with any truth. This week, an Iranian weapons ship was stopped in the Mediterranean containing thousands of rockets destined probably for Hezbollah, Syria, and perhaps even as far as Gaza. Those rockets were intended to kill Israeli civilians. And unfortunately, I do not expect the UN Human Rights Council or any major UN body to point out the constant involvement of the Islamic Republic of Iran in human rights violations, but particularly in war crimes against the State of Israel by facilitating repeated attacks on Israeli civilians. But let's get back to the language of the UN Gaza report. Let me say that the IDF is not what appears in this report. The Israeli army has been imbued for generations to avert civilian casualties at all costs. Israel's soldiers are taught the story of Halamideh, the 35 college students who comprised a unit of soldiers during Israel's 1948 War of Independence. Having captured at that time an Arab shepherd, these young soldiers vigorously debated among themselves whether to let him go, even though he might reveal their position. They decided to release him, and indeed, he did report their movements to the enemy, and all 35 soldiers were killed. I mention this story because Israelis have repeated it and taught it to new soldiers for decades. Not with regret at the tragic result, but with pride and an inspiring example. I would ask all students, Brandeis and others, to respect the speaker, even as most people in this audience are. You are not to disrupt. That's precisely the kind of discord, disharmony, and disrespect which the Goldstone report itself would decry. One of the human rights is the right of expression. Respect that right in the speaker who stands before you. Let me address this interruption because this country, the United States of America, fought a war 70 years ago so that people in the world would have freedom of speech and freedom of discussion, which is what this university is supposed to represent. But let me bring you back to the ethos of the Israeli army. As I said, we tell the story of the Lamed Hey, of the 35 who lost their lives because they spared the life of a single shepherd who they seized and who they let go of. And we don't tell that story to new soldiers in the IDF out of regret at the tragic result, but with pride and an inspiring example of the Army's ethos and humanity. Israeli soldiers retell the lessons of Kafr Qasim in 1953, where innocents who broke curfew were killed. And since that time, the IDF established the principle that when an order is given over which waves a moral black flag, that order must be disobeyed, and that is Israeli law. And in 2002, the IDF carried out an operation in the Jenin refugee camp, what Hamas used to call the capital of the suicide bombers. It chose to send its infantry, the state of Israel chose to send its infantry in house-to-house combat in Jenin to minimize collateral damage to the Palestinian side, even though in doing so, 23 Israeli soldiers lost their lives. And more recently in 2003, when the military leadership of Hamas sat together in one room in the Gaza Strip, Israel called off a military airstrike against them, using munitions that would have destroyed them in one blow because of the risk to civilian life. That same consideration guided Israel in 2009, when Hamas's command and control center was positioned in Gaza's Shifa hospital. That is the truth of who Israel really is, and that is who Israel will always be. And I say that regardless of what is written in the UN Gaza report. It is for that reason that the UN Gaza report has been condemned all across Israel's political spectrum. That reaction comes from the mission's attempt to go beyond even its own evidence and its own sources, to impugn the motives of an entire country, to invent a policy and a nefarious purpose where there was none, to impute intentions and the motives of Israeli leaders months away from its field of research, to infer ill will where no such inference was warranted or even possible on the evidence available. And yet in the report, Hamas, a recognized international terrorist organization, according to both the United States and the European Union, as well as others, is almost protected throughout its text. Its forces appear innocuously as, quote, Palestinian armed groups, unquote. It is no wonder that Musa Abu Marzouk, the deputy head of the Hamas Political Bureau, concluded this month, and I quote, "The report acquits Hamas almost entirely," unquote. In contrast, there are severe and explicit allegations against Israel, misrepresenting its very purpose and strategic aim in this Gaza operation, which obfuscate, first, the fundamental fact that Operation Cast Lead, also known as the Gaza War, was a war of self-defense. The report claims, for example, in paragraph 1883, in its conclusions and recommendations, and I quote, "While the Israeli government has sought to portray its operations as essentially a response to rocket attacks in the exercise of its right of self-defense, the mission considers the plan to have been directed, at least in part, at a different target, the people of Gaza as a whole," unquote. This language reflects what Professor Christine Chinkin, one of the members of this fact-finding mission, charged as a co-signer to a published letter in the Times of London on January 11th, 2009, even before she joined the mission, and only a week after the war began, when judgments would have been completely premature. The letter stated, nonetheless, and I quote, "Israel's actions amounted to aggression and not self-defense." A day later, on January 12, 2009, when the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva created the international fact-finding mission that Justice Goldstone headed, it called on the international community to end, quote, "the current military aggression in Gaza," unquote. The UN Gaza report itself
does not differ significantly from these positions, for it attempts to portray Israel as seeking to punish the Palestinians in Gaza for electing Hamas in 2006. As it states in its concluding section in paragraph 1884, quote, "In this respect, the operations were in furtherance of an overall policy aimed at punishing the Gaza population for its resilience and for its apparent support for Hamas, and possibly with the intent of forcing a change in such support." This speculation has nothing to do with the reality Israel faced for 8 whole years as its civilians absorbed 12,000 rocket and mortar attacks. These were most notably directed at the brave citizens of Sderot. By 2008, the terror you just witnessed spread to many other Israeli cities, including as far as Beersheba. You see here an attack on yet another school, in this case, actually a direct hit on a school in Beersheba. Only by a miracle, the students were not in the school at the time. The fact of the matter is that by 2008, as you can see on this map, nearly 1 million Israelis came under the reach of Hamas rocket fire launched from Gaza. Remember, it was Israel that withdrew completely from Gaza in September 2005. But Hamas only escalated its rocket attacks in response from the very territory that Israel had evacuated. If you look at the bar chart, you see that between 2005 and 2006, between the year Israel pulled out and the year that followed, rocket fire increased by a factor of 500%. And it was Hamas that officially declared that it was breaking the Egyptian-sponsored Tahadiyah, or calm, a kind of semi-ceasefire, which it declared it was ending on December 19th, 2008, prior to the beginning of hostilities. It then further escalated rocket attacks on the citizens of Israel. The facts speak for themselves. There is no question of who committed aggression against whom. The single reason Israel went to war on December 27th, 2008 was to finally bring the rain of rocket fire on its civilians to a halt. Yet the principal problem with the UN Gaza report is not just the question of how it explained the motives of Israel's Gaza operation. It is the repeated claim in the report that Israel, as part of its official policy, deliberately killed Palestinian civilians. You see here repeated quotations about deliberate attacks against civilian population, a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population. Now, how does the Gaza report of the UN reach these conclusions? I'm going to focus on 3 elements that seem to be very strongly pronounced in the way the report presents its arguments. First, it talks about deliberate attacks against non-combatants. Second of all, it deals with the scale of the destruction in the Gaza Strip. And third, it talks about attacks on public buildings, for example, particularly mosques. Here, for example, is a quote from the report on deliberate attacks on non-combatants. The mission found numerous instances of deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian objects, individuals, whole families, houses, mosques, in violation of the fundamental international humanitarian law principle of distinction, resulting in deaths and serious injuries. But the real picture of what went on in Gaza has to be seen when you look very carefully at what Hamas succeeded in building here in northern Gaza City. What you see here in this map, and this is a military map, are the military positions which Hamas intentionally embedded inside the civilian population. Most notably, the red dots with white stars in them are Qassam launching sites also used by Grad rockets as well. There are areas here that contain weapon storage areas, training areas, all embedded in the civilian population. Now I ask you a question. What would you do if your population is facing repeated rocket attacks for 8 years and your enemy is embedding his military capability in his own civilian area? You have basically three choices. The first choice you could decide upon is something I would utterly reject. It's a policy similar to perhaps what Russia did in Chechnya, indiscriminate attacks, regardless of the presence of civilians. That is not a policy Israel would ever pursue. There's a second choice, giving up, saying, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do in this kind of instance. There's no way of defending your civilians in a war on terrorism, so what will I do? I'll give Hamas basically a warrant to kill my own civilians. But there's a third choice, and that was the choice that Israel pursued. And it was a deliberate strategy to try and separate the Palestinian civilians from the military capability that Hamas intentionally embedded in the civilian areas. And this was done by multiple means. First of all, the Palestinian areas where Israel had to conduct military operations, when, let's say, a house, according to the Israeli military, was known to contain Grad rockets and other explosives, Israel sent multiple warnings and a whole multiple layers of warnings to the civilian population. First, of course, Israel entered into the radio transmissions of Hamas so that people listening to the radio could hear the warnings they received. Secondly, leaflets were dropped over whole areas of the Gaza Strip, which were potential target areas. And if that didn't work, there was an attempt to directly contact Palestinian families, either through their cell phone or through their home phones. For example, one such message is here, which is translated for those who do not understand the Arabic.
بلاغ عسكري. جيش الدفاع الإسرائيلي سيضرب ويدمر كل مبنى وموقع يوجد فيه ذخيرة وعتاد عسكري. ابتداء من نشر هذا البيان، كل من توجد ذخيرة وعتاد عسكري في بيته فهو معرضا للخطر وعليه مغادرة المكان حفاظا لحياته وحياة أسرته. قيادة جيش الدفاع الإسرائيلي.
Now, how do you know that they actually received those warnings? So what we have following this is a clip from Hamas television, which actually shows, A, that they knew the warnings were coming, and B, the Hamas effort to compensate for that, to keep the civilian population and the military capability of Hamas together. This, again, is taken from Hamas television at approximately the same time.
عودت قوات الاحتلال من جديد تهديدها بقصف منازل المواطنين عبر الاتصال بالهاتف، حيث هددت بقصف منزل المواطن أبو بلال الجعابير بشمال قطاع غزة، الأمر الذي دفع المواطنين للتوجه إلى منزل الجعابير مشكلين دروعا بشرية في محاولة لمنع الاحتلال من قصف المنزل وتشريد أهله.
فتحت الجوال وإذا به يسأل: أنت أبو بلال الجعابير؟ قلت نعم. فقال: أنا الأمن الإسرائيلي، معك 5 دقائق تخلي أنت أولادك. فأقفلت الجوال على الفور واتصلت ببعض الأصدقاء فهرع الأهالي عبر مكبرات الصوت وملأوا سطح المنزل وظلوا حتى الآن يعني مرابطون على سطح المنزل إلى أن يشاء الله سبحانه وتعالى.
المواطنون وفور سماع نبأ التهديد باستهداف المنزل خرجوا من منازلهم متوجهين إلى منزل الجعابير ليشكلوا دروعا بشرية في محاولة لمنع قصف المنزل.
This policy of using human shields to protect the Hamas military capability is something which the report, by the way, examined, but it couldn't reach any conclusions about Palestinian intent because it actually asked for a standard that's almost impossible to prove. It wanted to show that the Palestinians were forced to be human shields. So we'd have to produce some kind of evidence of actually somebody forcing them at gunpoint. The fact that the Hamas regime encouraged its people to be human shields seems to be something which the report did not think was adequate evidence of the human shield's position.
قد طور من موته ومن بحثه على الموت ولذلك أصبح الموت عند الشعب الفلسطيني صناعة تجيده النساء تجيده كل من في هذه الأرض يجيده الشيوخ يجيده المجاهدون ويجيده الأطفال لذلك شكلوا دروعا بشرية من النساء والأطفال والشيوخ والمجاهدين ليتحدوا بذلك آلة القصف الصهيونية وكأنهم يقولون للعدو الصهيوني إننا نحرص على الموت كما تحرصون على
Now this man's name is Fatih Hamad. He was a member of the Hamas parliament at the time that he made this statement in 2008. Today he is the interior minister of the Hamas regime, and he has said explicitly in a statement in the Gaza Strip that he coordinates with the resistance movements, with the mujahideen who fight the state of Israel. There is no separation of the Hamas regime from the armed elements that have been fighting us prior to the war, during the war, and after the war as well. There's another film here, but because of lack of time, I will not go into. But it's another example of how Israel repeatedly tries to protect civilians. If, for example, a missile or weapon system is launched against a particular target, and then the Israeli military reveals that civilians have entered the area, Israel repeatedly veered the rocket or the weapon away from the target area into an empty field so as to protect civilians. Now, my question to you is this. A country that goes through all of these efforts to try and protect Palestinian civilians, to try and separate the Palestinian civilian population from the military capability that Hamas embedded in that area, is that a country that engages in deliberate attacks against the civilian population? How can the huge effort made by the State of Israel in this regard, the devotion of manpower and resources to make this happen, how can this be seen as consistent with the charge, the principal charge of the Gaza report, the UN Gaza report, that Israel deliberately attacked Palestinian civilians? Part of the problem also is the definition of non-combatants, which is the charge that it makes. I'm only just going to say here that we have ample evidence showing that who the report views as a non-combatant, Palestinian policemen, are in fact overwhelmingly members of the Izz al-Din al-Qassam brigades and other units. On this particular graph, two members are of note. One is a member of an al-Qaeda unit in the Gaza Strip, a Palestinian policeman, and a second one was involved in the murder of Americans back in 2003. Of course, the report deals with the scale of destruction in the Gaza Strip. And Justice Goldstone spoke about the houses of Gaza that he witnessed, whose destruction he saw. Of course, what the report doesn't adequately examine is how Hamas itself booby-trapped large parts of the Gaza Strip. On the upper left-hand side, you see a Hamas map showing how a quadrant of northern Gaza was booby-trapped. They wanted to show which houses had the booby-trap materials and which didn't. which had the explosives and which didn't. If you count the squares of the houses in that picture, you realize that in a given sector of the Gaza Strip, roughly 20% of the houses were actually filled with explosives, and these are the various explosives that were there. The whole area was full of explosives in tunnels as well. And when Israel had to strike to defend itself, in certain particular areas, one saw secondary explosions that weren't caused by Israel, they were caused by Hamas. There is the issue of the attack on mosques. I go back and just let you see what the report actually says. It says that there is no evidence that mosques had been militarized. And therefore, it accepts the idea that if Israel had any attacks against mosques, it must have been for some vicious reason of its own. Mr. Travers, who's a member of the UN Commission, which investigated, of course, which engaged in the fact-finding commission, made a statement recently at the end of October in Harper's Magazine. We also found no evidence that mosques were used for munitions. Those charges reflect the perceptions of some quarters that Islam is a violent religion. I think he's dealing with some kind of ideological issues, but the facts of the matter is what Israel saw was that mosques had huge amounts of munitions in them. As you'll see in this case, this is the Al Zaytun Mosque, an area which, according to the report, had been pacified, but which had mortars, a large anti-aircraft system here that you see, and many other munitions inside. In fact, the whole idea of the militarization of mosques, which is very alien to me, the whole idea of religious sites being used for military purposes, was something which the United States found in Fallujah in 2004 when it had to destroy 60 mosques. Here you also see a case of Hamas attacking a mosque. This mosque belongs to a Salafist group in Rafiah, where a battle was waged this year between Hamas and the Salafists. And it only shows to what extent the area had been militarized and the mosques had been militarized. Let me move quickly to, I think, three very important points. Some of the sources which the UN Gaza report used to corroborate the witnesses that it had, the testimonies that it received, actually had serious criticism about the kind of conclusions that the report reached. For example, Jessica Montel from B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, wrote in the Huffington Post, the facts presented in the report itself would not seem to support such far-reaching conclusions. If you go to the Soldiers Who Break Silence, a very important source for the report, they suddenly say, there were briefings by commanders, this is on their website, there were briefings by commanders on the importance of not harming civilians and property and houses. Yet this material, which is clearly evident and clearly available on the web, was not used by the UN Gaza report. Finally, I have to say, and I'll bring this to an end very shortly, the Gaza report itself says that the mission notes that those interviewed in Gaza appeared reluctant to speak about the presence or the conduct of hostilities by Palestinian armed groups. Whatever the reasons for their reluctance, the mission does not discount that the interviewees' reluctance may have stemmed from fear of reprisals. So how can you get a clear picture from Palestinians that you interview that there were no military operations in an area when they're afraid to admit that there were military operations? And that goes to the heart of some of the hard 11 cases that are mentioned in the report that we'll discuss later. Let me bring to a conclusion. I won't conclude. I'll let somebody else conclude for me because I think he's probably the most articulate person who understands what happened to Israel and Gaza.
Go to United Nations Watch.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. I served with NATO and the United Nations, commanded troops in Northern Ireland, Bosnia and Macedonia, and participated in the Gulf War. I spent considerable time in Iraq since the 2003 invasion and worked on international terrorism for the UK government's Joint Intelligence Committee. Mr. President, based on my knowledge and experience, I can say this. During Operation Cast Lead, the Israeli Defence Forces did more to safeguard the rights of civilians in a combat zone. Both will always have people ready to give interviews condemning Israeli forces for war crimes. They are adept at staging and distorting incidents. The IDF faces a challenge that we British do not have to face to the same extent. It is the automatic Pavlovian presumption by many in the international media and international human rights groups that the IDF are in the wrong, that they are abusing human rights. The truth is that the IDF took extraordinary measures to give Gaza civilians notice of targeted areas, dropping over 2 million leaflets and making over 100,000 phone calls. Many missions that could have taken out Hamas military capability were aborted to prevent civilian casualties. During the conflict, the IDF allowed huge amounts of humanitarian aid into Gaza. To deliver aid virtually into your enemy's hands is, to the military tactician, normally quite unthinkable. But the IDF took on those risks. Despite all of this, of course innocent civilian lives were lost. War is chaos and full of mistakes. There have been mistakes by the British, American and other forces in Afghanistan and in Iraq, many of which can be put down to human error. But mistakes are not war crimes. More than anything, the civilian casualties were a consequence of Hamas's way of fighting. Hamas deliberately tried to sacrifice its own civilians. Mr. President, Israel had no choice, apart from defending its people, to stop Hamas from attacking them with rockets. And I say this again, the IDF did more to safeguard the rights of civilians in a combat zone than any other army in the history of warfare.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Goldstone. Thank you, Ambassador Gold. We are running a little behind, but we want to take questions and comments, but very short, succinct questions that will allow our speakers to continue the conversation. I'm sure there are a number of things Justice Goldstone would like to say in response, and perhaps Ambassador Gold as well, but let's try to do it in the context of some succinct questions. There will be a couple of ground rules with this. First, I'm going to give priority, as I said earlier, to Brandeis students and faculty. Please identify yourselves clearly, say your class or your department of affiliation, as well as your name. Keep your comments and questions quite brief so we can hear more from the speakers themselves. And I'm going to take several questions at once so that we can get a few different ideas out on the table and our speakers can then respond seriatim. There are students with handheld microphones, and when I call on you, if you can make your way to the aisle nearest where they are, and that way you'll be able to use the microphone there. I'm going to throw out an initial question and then take three from the audience and then let the speakers respond. One thing we haven't heard so much about, Justice Goldstone, are the specific 36 incidents that your mission investigated. And along the line in our discussion tonight, it might be useful for you to give the audience here a sense of the one or two of those 36 specific incidents that you feel make the most compelling case for the overall conclusions of your report and why you think those specific incidents lead in that direction. And Ambassador Gold may want to use that as an opportunity to talk about what he considers some of the weaknesses of the methodology of the report. Okay, if I can get some hands here. Can I get a microphone up towards the front here? In the third row there. I'm going to call on, is there a student towards the back on the right there? And in right by the aisle there. Yeah, come a little closer. Right here, yeah, okay. So let's take those three questions first. If you move your way to the aisle and ask your questions briefly. I will reserve the right to intervene if you're going on for too long because we really want to get to hearing the speakers.
Thank you. My question is for Ambassador Gold. My name, sorry about that. I'm Jeremy Scherer. I'm a senior and I'm a politics and Islamic and Middle Eastern studies student. My question is, given what you say and that this report was in fact so terrible and so flawed, why has the Israeli government refused to launch an internal investigation on this issue? Would that not be the best way to combat a report that is so flawed by presenting what the Israeli government clearly believes is the truth, as the government is so incredibly opposed to these ideas? And moreover,
thank you. If I can ask that we not make this into a competition about who can generate the most applause for questions, but let's get the questions out and then let the speakers respond.
The only thing on top of that is asking if Israelis themselves and its supporters of Israel worldwide do not deserve to know the truth about what happened in Gaza.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Mandy Paust. I'm a student at the Heller School for Social Policy, a grad student and management in the Sustainable International Development Program. And mine is also for Ambassador Gold. I would ask you to, if you could please address a little bit what the report described as disproportionate response by Israel toward Gaza, and specifically, if you could, what I noticed in that you draw a lot of comparisons, but to really look at the situation on its own would be great. Thank you.
And one more.
Hi, my name is Sarah Geller. I'm a freshman, and I plan to study international relations and Islamic and Middle Eastern studies. My question is directed to Judge Goldstone. In the 2004 Sese case in the United Nations created special court of Sierra Leone, Justice Robertson was one of the 5 judges assigned to the case originally. However, when his lack of impartiality was revealed, he was disqualified. So in regards to this report, how can this report be considered fair and unbiased when Professor Christine Chinkin of the London School of Economics stated in an article her judgment that Israel committed war crimes and signed the letter that showed how closed-minded she was, and that and even with all that and being brought to the committee's attention, she was not removed from the investigation. During the mission, you did promise the investigation would be both impartial and objective. Thank you.
Thank you. Judge Goldstone, you want to start?
I didn't get the end of the last question.
The last question asked about Professor Chinkin and about why she had not been disqualified.
Well, if I first might respond to Dr. Terrace's question of just a couple of incidents that drove us to the conclusion that certainly in some instances civilians were intentionally attacked. We chose 36 incidents, and we chose the 36 incidents very carefully, and there, let me say, is absolutely no truth in the fabricated allegation that came out that we were given these incidents by Hamas. We chose the incidents. Nobody gave them or suggested them to us. That would, I hardly need to add, have been completely unacceptable to me and the other members of the mission. But the one attack that certainly affected me was an attack on a mosque in Gaza City, a 3-year-old mosque, during a service. They were combined because of the war, and they were attacked by a missile fired presumably well, not presumably, were fired from IDF ground forces. The missile came through the front door of the mosque, killed some 21 people and injured many more. There was no question at all of any secondary explosions, which indicated that there was no question of ammunition being kept there. But even if it was, there is no basis in law that you can, assuming in favor of the attackers that there was ammunition being stored there, you don't mortar shell it during a service. If you do it at night, if you want to bomb that mosque for any reason. And that hasn't been explained at all. It's that sort of incident that screams out, that cries out for investigation by an open, a credible investigation in Israel. And why shouldn't they do that? The other example was the bombing of and complete demolition of schools. In particular, the one I couldn't understand, and I went to see it, was the complete demolition of the American school in Gaza City. And I still would love to know why the Israeli Defense Force or the Israeli government chose the American school. It was the center of anti-Hamas activity. Hamas hated the American school. It didn't teach Sharia law. It had an American curriculum. Why was that school demolished? No explanation. It screams out for investigation. And other schools. The UNRWA compound attacked with white phosphorus. The UNRWA compound attacked with white phosphorus containing some 120,000 liters of gas. Had that exploded, and it was a miracle it didn't, there would have been a conflagration in the middle of Gaza City. Again, and let me say that white phosphorus was landing after many, many phone calls by the UN personnel to the Israeli Defense Force because they had direct lines of communication. Again, screams for investigation. The infrastructure. Ambassador Gold, with respect, has been very silent. There's been not a word from Israel explaining why the whole food industrial infrastructure of the Gaza Strip was destroyed. If that isn't collective punishment, what is? Again, that screams out for investigation. The Israeli leaders need to be called to account to explain why the ordinary people of Gaza, the women, the children, and men, are being put in a position of unemployment, of penury, of misery. And if that isn't collective punishment, again, what is? The last question put to me was about Professor Chinkin, and I've explained the position on many occasions. Professor Chinkin, at the end of the first week, when many people, it was no secret what was happening in Gaza, Al Jazeera was there filming it. Anybody, and we in South Africa get Al Jazeera, English, and we saw the destruction in Gaza City. She signed a letter together with other leading international lawyers in the United Kingdom, in which she said that this was aggression. And it was a technical issue. The International Court of Justice held that an occupying power cannot act in self-defense. The consequence would be it would be a police action. And this is one of the issues that we saw no point in going into, because whether Israel's an occupation or isn't an occupation, it was entitled fully by international humanitarian law, international human rights law, to take either military action or police action to stop what is clearly the most serious criminal conduct. And that was the statement Professor Chinkin made, and she added, not she, the letter added, and this Ambassador Gold didn't mention, the letter added that Hamas had committed war crimes in sending rockets and mortars into Israel. It wasn't a judicial investigation, as the Sierra Leone tribunal was. Judge Robertson, an English judge, had written in a recent book he had written, condemned one of the sides in a Sierra Leone war. And he was forced by his colleagues to recuse themselves. He couldn't, as a judge, sit in that position. And as I said at the time, if our fact-finding mission was even a quasi-judicial, let alone a judicial inquiry, I think Professor Chinkin would have had no option but to recuse herself. The issues we were looking at was how military force was used, and that was an issue on which she didn't commit herself at all. And that was a reason that she and we agreed, felt that she could continue to sit on the mission. Speak on it, mate.
Let me tell you something about, is this working?
Keep it close to you.
Yeah. Let me tell you something about how the Israeli military justice system works, because it's part of the civilian justice system. In many countries, for example, if a divisional commander doesn't want his division investigated, he's the final arbiter of that question.
In the Israeli system, we have a supreme military legal figure called the Military Advocate General. And he can initiate an investigation of any soldier, of any event, of any crime that's alleged, if he wants to. But let's say he doesn't fulfill his responsibility. We have civilian oversight of our military. And if a divisional commander doesn't want it, if the Military Advocate General doesn't want to investigate something, our Attorney General can initiate an investigation of any Israeli soldier, of any Israeli action. And let's say our Attorney General fails to do his job. Well, in our system of law, the Israeli Supreme Court can step in and actively initiate any investigation of this type, of these types of events. I personally have full confidence in the Israeli legal system to get to the bottom of the Gaza war. Now, of the 36 incidents that are mentioned in the report, there are 12 that the Israeli army never heard of. And those 12 are being investigated as we speak today. I trust that Israel can investigate itself. I trust that the Israeli legal system, its Supreme Court, its Attorney General, and the Military Advocate General know how to get to the bottom of these issues and can set them in the right framework and present the truth of what is going on. And therefore, I don't believe that we need to create a new special investigation because of the charges that are made against the State of Israel in this report, many of which I have my serious doubts about. Now, let me just mention, because Justice Goldstone mentioned the alleged attack on the Ibrahim al-Makadma Mosque, where Palestinians had been praying. The Israeli position has been that that mosque was not attacked by Israel. Now, the question we have to face, and this is the challenge of the mission, it's the challenge of Israelis investigating this matter, is reconstructing a reality that is no longer with us. Trying to understand what happened at a specific event months after it occurred. An explanation is given by the mission that there was an Israeli attack. But do we know that perhaps munitions exploded in the mosque itself? Do we know who were the figures who were operating in the mosques? On the websites of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other organizations, there are indications of who were the people in the mosque who were killed. And I am not trying to figure out and justify any military operation that is illegal or over which there's a black flag, as we say, in the State of Israel. But I believe there are other possible outcomes that could have been investigated on the basis of information that's publicly available, mostly in Arabic, on websites, that could give us a clue as to what transpired in that mosque. But as I'm telling you this, Israel did not attack that mosque. On the issue of a disproportionate use of force, I would suggest that Justice Goldstone explained to you the legal doctrine. It is much more complicated. It is not just if somebody throws a Qassam rocket at you, you throw a Qassam rocket back at him of the exact weight and the exact size. It's a whole legal doctrine that has to be fully understood and explained, and I hope you, as students at Brandeis, will study it.
Well, can I just respond to two issues? Firstly, Israel's legal system. Ambassador Gold is conflating Israel's outstanding civil regular legal system and its Supreme Court with military justice. What's happening is that the investigations to date, and it's now, 9 months since the end of Operation Cart Lead, the military is investigating itself behind closed doors. That's not a legal system. That's not a judicial system. It's not justice at all. And what's the result been? In 9 months, after the allegations made not only by our report, allegations were made by Israeli, by Palestinian, by international organizations for the last 10 months since Operation Cast Lead began. What's been the result? One conviction for the theft of a credit card. I mean, that's demeaning of the victims in Gaza. And finally, as far as the mosque is concerned, we found the remnants of the Israeli ammunition and the tungsten squares that were pulled out of the wall in my presence. And you know, really with respect, Ambassador Gold saying Israel didn't do it and then justifying it reminds me of the old story, apocryphal story, of the man charged with rape. He said, I didn't do it, I wasn't there. My alternative defense is she consented. I mean, this is the sort of defense that's being made. That's not what I said.
Bring three more questions into the mix. One there. Yeah. One in the front here. And one in the middle there. Yeah, right there.
My name is Rebecca Schlengel. I'm a senior, an independent study in mass media and communications. And my question is for Justice Goldstone. I believe that you mentioned twice that you do not have access to any officials from the Israeli Defense Force or any residents from southern Israel or any officials from the Israeli government. But yet you stated that the report is unbiased. Wouldn't not having access to the information, even if Israel was the one to deny you the access, wouldn't not having that information lead to a biased report? Given your reputation, why did you choose to go forward with a report that could obviously not come out unbiased?
It asks, why did you go for a report that was obviously biased in its start? In the front.
So my name is Lisa Hanania. I'm a Palestinian. I'm a junior in international and global studies. And I'm just disappointed that the Palestinian perspective is not presented in this event.
This is a place for questions. No, you'll excuse me. That's not a question. That's a statement.
I'm going to ask. Okay.
I want questions,
Justice
not
Goldstone,
statements.
I want to ask you, if you may, how do you feel as a UN representative, as somebody who's supposed to represent the balance between, somewhat of a balance between Palestinians and Israelis, and to try to find the truth? How do you feel I feel disrespected in your name. So how do you feel with the fact that there is no Palestinian perspective on this debate, or just speaking on your own? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, but that's actually a question that should be answered by the organizers of the debate, not the people who were invited to it.
Hi, my name is Liza Barrett. I am a junior here and a major in politics. And my question is for Justice Goldstone. In this speech and mainly in the report, you've talked mainly about actions during Operation Cast Lead. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the conditions in Gaza that have been a fact before the invasion and still exist, and how that affects life in Gaza, apart from just military actions.
Well, I think the three questions were directed primarily at me. As far as getting involved in a bias situation, obviously I was saddened that we didn't get the cooperation of Israel, as I said. The sort of information that we were shown by Ambassador Gold should have been shown to us during the investigation. Why afterwards? It really is difficult to understand. And if we didn't get it officially from the Israeli government, surely we should have been allowed to come in to get it in any event. We had to go to the ridiculous lengths of the UN having to bring at its expense citizens of a democratic state to give us evidence in Geneva. We had to meet with other Israelis in Amman, Jordan. It was very difficult to do it, but we did what we could to ensure that we looked at both sides, and that's why we went to great lengths to investigate and demonstrate the terror effects of the rockets and mortars on southern Israel and Sderot in particular. I take your point about the organizers being responsible. Let me say, because I think I should put it on record, that I would have liked to have seen a representative of the Palestinian people also on the platform. As far as the conditions in Gaza is concerned, I must say that my visit to Gaza turned out very differently from what I'd anticipated. I was quite frankly, and I make and I'm not ashamed to say it, I was very nervous, a Jew going to Gaza controlled by Hamas, especially when the first reaction to my appointment for Hamas was to reject my leading it because I was Jewish. And my wife sitting here will remember 3 nights before I woke up in the night after a terrible nightmare with sweat on my brow because I'd had a vivid dream that I'd been kidnapped by Hamas, and people in Israel were rejoicing. That was the nightmare, but it was based on real fear. But I'm happy to say, met warmly by ordinary Palestinians. And what struck me in particular was how similar the people of Gaza are to the people of Israel. The atmosphere, the warmth, the food, everything that goes on. And that made me feel even more sad at what is happening, at the ordinary people who are suffering the effect of the blockade, the siege of Gaza, is having huge effects. People are reliant on humanitarian aid. And you know what that does to your dignity? That you can't earn your own living, you can't buy your own food, but because of a political policy foisted on Gaza, people are forced to get what they can as handouts, and they never know from day to day what's going to be allowed in to Gaza. The other thing that struck me was a huge physical damage. You can't drive a block in Gaza City without seeing destroyed homes, destroyed government buildings, the Parliament building, the Department of Education, the central prison, which allowed criminals to escape. And that was very hard to see, and also to realize that no rebuilding has begun at all because of the blockade not allowing any building materials at all into Gaza. And we saw thousands of people living in makeshift tents that had to be erected by the United Nations because people can't rebuild their homes.
I think this gets to the heart of the problem with the report. There's no question that there was enormous damage in Gaza as a result of the war. No one will deny that. But here is one of the mysteries that I didn't understand. Why doesn't Hamas appear as a responsible party for what happened? Because again, if you read the report, just look at the summary as well as the body of the report. It relates to armed groups. Who are these armed groups? Which armed groups? The report almost grants a legitimacy to Hamas because Hamas is not criticized for the policy that led to the disaster on the Palestinians. By the way, if you invited Palestinians, you'd have to make a choice who to invite, a representative of Hamas or a representative of the Palestinian Authority, of Fatah. And therefore, when you witness the destruction that occurred in Gaza, you have to ask the fundamental question: who booby-trapped the buildings in Gaza? Who launched an 8-year war against the state of Israel? Who put explosives and dug tunnels under civilian homes? And what was the responsibility of, yes, the Hamas political leadership, which seems to get off the hook, which sat in the parliament? What is their responsibility for guiding and directing this war? This war would never have happened if rockets weren't fired at the state of Israel. Remember, Israel withdrew from Gaza in September 2005. It had no desire to go back there. And I know we hear all the time about the blockade of Gaza, but through the Egyptian border, there are huge amounts of goods and services running between Egypt and Gaza. And if that area should be opened more, let the Egyptians open it. It's up to them. It's their border. But to put the responsibility on Israel because of the closure in Gaza, why should Israel open up its borders to Gaza when it's being pelted by rockets every other day? So again, the report would have real credibility if it treated Israel fairly, if it didn't make the judgments it made on the basis of evidence that's very questionable, and if it finally pinned the blame on the entity that is responsible for creating this crisis and creating tragedy for the Palestinian people, and that's the leadership of Hamas.
At the risk of keeping you from your dinner, it's a very unusual opportunity, so I'm going to take one final round of questions before we conclude. One in the front row here. On the side section, in the middle there. On the aisle over here.
First of all, my name is Ofir Abu. I'm an Israeli Jew who is very concerned about the fate of his country. And I'm also a PhD student here at Brandeis in the politics department. As someone who wants to learn from this report, I have a question for you, Justice Goldstone. And thank you both for coming out, first of all. There seems to be, Justice Goldstone, there seem to be two disagreements between the mission and Israel. First of all, it's about the rules of war and what to do when a country faces a terrorist threat. And the second disagreement is regarding the definition of Hamas. What is Hamas? Is it an insurgency? Is it a terrorist organization? Is it, as you call it, Gaza authorities? I don't know.
You're going to have to go straight to the question.
Yeah.
Though, okay.
So how would you, and in terms of that, I want to ask you, how would you suggest for states from now on to respond to terrorist threats? And how would you suggest to Israel to respond or to engage with Hamas? One question for
I'm sorry, we got to stop it there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sherelle Gez. I'm a sophomore at Brandeis. I'm majoring in politics and Islamic Middle Eastern studies. My question is for Justice Goldstone. You speak about these instances that scream for investigation in Gaza, but what about the Israelis that suffered for 8 years in Sderot, in Gush Katif, in Ashkelon, in Israel? What about those people? They have been suffering from collective punishment by Hamas, and this collective punishment is just because they're Jewish and because they live in Israel. And I want to know, where was your voice then, and where was the investigation then? That's what I want to know, because it's too late now for investigation about Hamas. It should have been done years ago.
And the third question?
My name is Avi Snyder. I'm a freshman here at Brandeis. I have no major yet. I really have questions for both of you, but I take it I can only ask one. So then my question is for Justice Goldstone. You mentioned in your speech how you certainly acknowledge that Israel had a right to defend itself against rocket attacks on its civilian population, and you said that in your report, you certainly make no claim that Israel didn't have this right. I'm curious, because you accuse Israel of engaging in a disproportionate response, what, in your judgment, would have constituted a proportionate response to the rocket attacks against Sderot and Ashkelon? And I understand you're not a military strategist, but I just feel like it's important to know if what Israel did was disproportionate, what could have been done.
Well, question one about, the first question had two questions. Firstly, about the rules of war. And incidentally, proportionality has got nothing to do with comparing what one side uses and the other side uses. It's got nothing to do with. Proportionality is what's proportionate in respect of the military advantage sought and the number of innocent civilians killed. I'll give you a simple example. If there's an ammunition factory in the middle of Boston, and a 1,000-pound bomb can take out the ammunition factory, which is a military target, and kill 100 civilians, or a 2,000 bomb can do the same job on the military factory and kill 5,000 civilians. The first is proportionate, not a war crime. The second is disproportionate, a war crime. That's what it's about, not comparing what rockets with rockets. What is Hamas? Hamas is for good or ill, the government of Gaza. It controls the whole of the Gaza Strip. It controls the civil police force. It controls the taxes. It's got judges who condemn people and, unfortunately, in my view, execute people. They've got capital punishment in the Gaza Strip. It's a government. At the same time, it's got a military wing, the Qassam brigades, that sends rockets and has been sending rockets by their thousands into Israel. We got a completely unsatisfactory response from Hamas. You know, at the end of our inquiry, we sent a questionnaire to Israel, to Hamas, and to the Palestinian Authority, asking sometimes embarrassing questions. Israel ignored our questionnaire completely. The other two didn't. We asked Hamas where the rockets were fired from. The answer from Hamas, we don't know, that's the military wing. We asked Hamas to tell us about Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier who had been abducted more than 3 years ago now. We asked about his mental and physical condition. Answer, don't ask us, that's the military wing. So they very shrewdly adopt this divorce where the one hand doesn't know what the other hand of the same body is doing. So it's a very difficult, amorphous situation, governing on the one hand, but using terrorist tactics against Israel on the other. How you deal with that it seems to me, from a political point of view, would make a very good semester paper in the politics department. Collective punishment of the people of Sderot, of course, and the report deals with it. I beg you to read chapter 24 of the report, where we deal in some detail with the effect on the people of southern Israel of the mortar and rocket attacks. Disproportionate response, what would be a proportionate response? It's a question that's given me many, many hours of sleepless nights. What is a proportionate response in this asymmetric situation? It may well be that a proportionate response is commando operations. That may be, but that costs lives. And that's a question it's a political question that the Israeli government and the Israeli army would have to take. A proportionate response may well be, as Ambassador Gold, I think, certainly implied, would be to bomb the places where Israeli intelligence has information that rockets and ammunition are being stored. And if there's so-called collateral damage, I hate the expression collateral damage, it's much worse than that. One's talking about killing innocent civilians. If the cost is in killing innocent civilians, as long as it's proportionate to the military aim, it seems to me that would not be a war crime. But if it's disproportionate, and bombs and white phosphorus and flechettes are used, anti-personnel munitions that are designed to kill people and not to destroy buildings and not to destroy ammunition and rockets, that's disproportionate. So it's not something that we had to decide, fortunately. What we had to decide was what action was proportionate and what action was disproportionate?
Yeah. I think that one of the central elements of our disagreement is how to treat the Hamas regime. You have a regime that has taken over the Gaza Strip. It evicted the Palestinian Authority, which previously ruled both Gaza and the West Bank. And the question is, what do you do? Do you relate and recognize it as the legitimate authority in the Gaza Strip? Or do you say, wait a minute, this organization is an international terrorist organization according to the United States, the European Union, Canada, and another group of countries. Now, in the case of Afghanistan, when the Taliban ruled Afghanistan completely back in 2001, and they gave sanctuary to an organization called Al-Qaeda that attacked this country, you reached a conclusion. And that conclusion was you had to take down the Taliban regime in Kabul. True, they ran to Pakistan, and they're coming back. But you set a principle that you can't allow terrorist regimes to give sanctuary to international terrorist organizations, which by definition attack innocent civilians and commit war crimes. So I think this is one of the central elements where we differ. I don't think you can create or treat the Hamas as a legitimate regime. And I think that Hamas is hosting and supporting terrorism of its own and terrorism of others is something which the report had to deal with. And I don't think you deal with that adequately when you just say armed groups, that innocuous comment that keeps repeating in the report ad infinitum.
Thank you. I want to thank the students for their very thoughtful questions, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Troen, to help close the evening.
We're going to move towards conclusion now, and we're going to give both Justice Goldstone and Ambassador Gold an opportunity for a very brief reflection before we wrap up. And we're going to go in the reverse order. First, Ambassador Gold.
I would like to bring my comments back to the organization that gave life to this UN Gaza report, the United Nations. It's no secret that the UN Human Rights Council and that other bodies of the United Nations mistreat the state of Israel systematically. And the question that has to be asked by all of us when we look at the UN, and when the UN commissions a report of this sort, is what are the rights of a minority government, meaning a government, a state which is a minority in the international system, facing the tyranny of the majority repeatedly in the UN. That is the heart of the problem. And that is how the UN will be judged. The UN will not be judged on how the NAM movement, the non-aligned movement, votes together automatically on a whole assortment of issues, and how it defends the interests of the 130 countries that belong to the non-aligned movement. I think that was roughly the number when I served at the UN. It will be judged on how it treats minorities. The Jewish state is a minority in the international system. We do not have natural allies. We have the United States and the Security Council. But we're not in a position where if we are assaulted, if we are mistreated systematically, that countries will circle the wagons to protect us. So you go after Luxembourg, the EU will protect you. You go after Singapore, ASEAN will protect you. You go after somebody in Africa, the African Union will sound off. You go after Sudan, we know who's going to protect you. But you go after Israel in the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, no one is there to protect us. And that is good enough reason for the state of Israel to not cooperate with an investigation of this sort. And finally, it's good enough reason to leave the investigation of what is a just war in the hands of those we trust, not just the Israeli military justice system, but the Israeli civilian justice system, the Attorney General and the Israeli Supreme Court, who I have complete faith in would get to the bottom of any war crimes, alleged war crimes, that are related to this conflict. Thank you.
Well, I didn't intend to talk again about the United Nations, but I must respond to Ambassador Gold's point. If Israel, because of its isolation, it seems to me would have been well advised, and I think there are many in Israel, including Minister Herzog, there are many in Israel who would advise the government precisely for that reason to cooperate with an even-handed mandate and to take the moral high ground and to use it as the beginning and insisting that this was a new beginning for the Human Rights Council, treating Israel in an even-handed fashion. And it's had that effect indirectly, because the resolution adopting the report, as I said earlier, includes the report's very serious findings against Hamas and the other militant Palestinian groups, as we've called them. I just want to make a couple of very short points. Firstly, I question the statement made by Ambassador Gold that our report has been condemned by all spectrums in Israeli society. That's not my impression. If one reads all of the Israeli media, as I've been trying to do to the best of my ability, and if I interpret some of the emails I receive from people I've never heard of in Israel, there are many people there who don't accept that the policy was an appropriate one with regard to Operation Cast Lead. Secondly, breaking the silence used by Ambassador Gold. What he hasn't explained is why the Israeli government made publicly made overtures to the United Kingdom and Dutch governments to stop giving financial support to that organization and threatening legislation to stop human rights organizations in Israel receiving foreign funding. And it's certainly something that we report in our Gaza report, because this arose directly out of Operation Cast Lead. Finally, the need for an investigation. I still hope, against all the odds and against the strong objections of Defense Minister Barak, I still hope that there will be an open investigation and not in darkness the military investigating itself. May I end with thanking Brandeis University so much for having given both Ambassador Gold and me this opportunity this afternoon. Brandeis really has lived up to its reputation of seeking the truth. And I think we can all, and I certainly feel very proud to be associated with Brandeis University, and to thank you all for your attention, for your politeness, and your willingness to hear views that must be anathema to one side or the other. Thank you very much.
Like all movies, whether they're good or they're bad, and this has been a good movie, you have to end with the credits. And there are some people who walk out when the credits are being said, and some people who remain. I would ask you to remain for another moment. The first credit, the most important credit, I think, is to the students, you in the audience. The event is not over. We hope that this event has not resolved everything for you. Some of you came with your minds made up. Some of you came with an open mind. All came, we hope, with a readiness to learn. So let's return to the phrase that Justice Goldstone and President Reinhardt used, truth, even unto its innermost parts. A quick lesson in Hebrew. The word emet is not veritas, which another university somewhere along the Charles River uses, nor does it mean truth. Emet is composed of 3 letters, Aleph, Mem, Taf. Aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, Taf is the last, and Mem is in the middle. And a lot of generations of observers and scholars before me have noted that what that really means is that there are many depths to truth, many layers to truth. It's never simple. It's not one-sided. There's a kind of richness inherent in truth and in the search for truth. As such, you've been privileged to participate into two individuals who I think are genuinely concerned with the search for truth. They are righteous and passionate individuals who share a common commitment to human rights, the rule of law, and justice. And for all of this commonality, and the best of a tradition that is now 7,000 years old, they disagree. Wherever you stand on the issues of this discussion, we would hope for the following. If you came with a preconceived idea of the right and the true, I trust your idea was either deepened or altered, but I hope it did not remain unchanged. Continue reading, learning, listening, discussing, and especially disputing. Hopefully, there will be further opportunities on this campus to do so, and in the civil way we have tried to achieve this evening. This is also a moment to thank others, and I'm not going to take out the whole list of names, so I'll speak of categories. The students from Gen Ed Now who received no compensation for their services, the students who did receive compensation for their services, paltry as that compensation was, technical services who broadcast this to the campus, and actually you should know tonight, we've had emails from throughout the world. People have been watching, and thanks to archiving this webcast, people who will be watching again and again and again what was said here. There's public relations, there's the provost's office, there are the workers in the two centers, but especially Dr. Stephanie Gerber-Wilson, who has pulled all of this together, and a special thanks to her. And finally, and most important of all, on behalf of all of us here, and those watching through the web, I want to thank you both, Justice Goldstone and Ambassador Gold, for your manifest integrity, passion, moral commitments, devotion to the truth as each of you understand it, and your willingness to come to Brandeis to share. We hope to see you here again, either together or even singly. You leave us here at Brandeis much enriched and enlightened. We are in your debt. Thank you. Good evening to you all.